How long do you expect to live to? 80, 90, 100 years? In America, the average lifespan for men is around 76 years. Women are tallying a little higher at 81 years. But what if it could be and should be much longer? History is punctuated with accounts of people living exceptionally long lives, well beyond 100 years. Is this really possible? If so, what exactly is limiting the lifespan of modern humans? Today's guest, Dr. Anthony Chaffee, says the shift away from eating what our primitive ancestors ate is largely to blame. Dr. Chaffee is an American physician and a professional athlete who's used the carnivore diet to optimize his performance and health. A diet comprised solely of meat, eggs, fat, and possibly some dairy. Is human health really on the upward trend that we've been led to believe it's on? What can we learn from ancient and indigenous societies about eating to live healthier and longer? And how is modern food coming to resemble a narcotic? Welcome to Vital Signs, where we learn how to get healthier from all angles, from the biochemical and nutritional to the things we do that nourish our minds and our souls. I'm Brendon Fallon. In terms of everything that we could be doing to improve our health and increase our longevity and things like that, where would you place doing a dietary intervention? Where would you place carnivore or doing a ketogenic diet in the scheme of that?
I think it's extremely important. If we look at those animal models, if you feed animals food that they're not supposed to eat, they get very sick, but they get the same chronic diseases we get. They get obesity, diabetes, cancers, autoimmunity, arthritis, etc., Alzheimer's, or dementias of one degree or another. These are the same things that we're afflicted with. We see native populations that haven't been exposed to agriculture for 8,000 years, 10,000 years, like some of us have, such as the Native Australian Aboriginals and Native Americans. They have far higher rates of these chronic diseases, cancers, autoimmunity, diabetes, etc. Only when eating a Western diet, though. When they're eating their traditional diet, which is predominantly meat, maybe some different plants that, native plants that they know of, but typically they would eat those in times of distress when they weren't able to get the normal food that they did. But they're hunter gatherers with an emphasis on the hunter. Native Americans, the Great Plains, they had bison. They just ate bison year round, and that's why the American military and government wiped out all of the bison, killed over 100 million bison, down to about 50 of them. And that was what Wild Bill Hickok said. It was like every buffalo killed is an Indian dead, because they require this for the year. They need that food. So they transitioned in the last 150 years or so, and we saw in real time their health be significantly impacted, and now they have some of the highest rates of chronic disease in any population. And I think that is solely on the head of eating an inappropriate diet. Now we have a lot of other things. Now we have artificial ingredients. We have all these different chemicals that had never existed in nature before, that we just invented, and we get to put them in the food supply without proving that they're safe first. That's pretty crazy to me. We have stevia; it's a sweetener, but studies in mice have shown that using stevia, just like the equivalent of 1 can of stevia a day, actually lowers fertility rates by 55% in mice. And you say, okay, well, that's an animal model. Is that translatable to humans? Well, go back a step further and look at where that stevia comes from. It comes from a stevia plant that's used down in Paraguay. And what did the natives use it for in Paraguay? They used it for over 1,000 years for birth control, right? So this is crazy that we're just randomly putting these, and it may not even be random. Maybe they know exactly what they're doing. I don't know, but I do know that these things can cause harm, and they don't have to prove that they're safe first. And so we're putting all these random things in our food supply, and I think they are getting worse. We have ultra-processed seed oils that go through an extremely intensive industrial process using things like hexane and bleaches and all these other sorts of harmful chemicals to produce this nasty substance. And we see people having very serious harmful effects because of this. So we're putting all these things that just didn't even exist in nature, and now we're putting them in our food supply, let alone just eating plants that we're not designed to eat also. So I think this is a major, major burden on human health. And so about 90% of the things that people die from in Western countries like Australia, like America, like Europe, 90% of them are from these so-called non-communicable chronic diseases, and it's 74% worldwide. I think the vast majority of those non-communicable chronic diseases are from eating an inappropriate diet. And all the best evidence shows that humans biologically are carnivores, and that this is what you get every single nutrient that you need in the proportion that you need it from eating fatty meat, and you get nothing that's harmful to you. Saturated fat is not harmful to you. Cholesterol is not harmful to you. Red meat does not cause cancer. That has been shown again and again and again.
To get notice of new Vital Signs videos, follow me at C Vital Signs on Instagram and X. Interesting you mentioned the problem with these ultra-processed foods. I know this is a huge issue, and many doctors have said this to me. I'm just interested on the carbohydrate front, and you talked about the indigenous people of Australia, also America, and how they have a more extreme reaction to the carbohydrate intake and also these processed foods. But what about, say, in certain Asian cultures where they're eating so much rice? I mean, this is a carbohydrate, and you see, like Japan, for instance, a place in Japan is one of the blue zones. It has one of the highest longevities in the world. How would you interpret that situation where people are eating carbohydrates in the form of rice, but still don't seem to be that affected by that?
Yeah, well, the thing is too is that there's gradations, aren't there, right? So I mean, if you're eating a very clean, sort of more whole food diet, that is far and away better than an ultra processed food diet, because you can have the same proportion of carbohydrates, and coming from an ultra processed point of view, it can be more harmful than just eating, sort of whole cooked rice, things like that, fresh fish, all these other sorts of things. Japan has diseases and problems just like everybody else. The traditional Japanese diet does eliminate more of the sugars like fructose, high fructose corn syrup, cane sugar, those sorts of things. So the carbohydrates that they have are more glucose based as opposed to fructose based. And the work from Dr. Robert Lustig from UCSF has shown pretty clearly that fructose is a more damaging carbohydrate. So, different carbohydrates have different effects on your body, and fructose seems to be an extremely bad one. When the damage that comes to your body from high blood sugar, high glucose levels is called glycation. So these molecules physically fuse to other molecules, they permanently damage them. It's called the Maillard effect. So when you're browning a steak or you're cooking something, it sort of starts brown and crispy. That's actually that effect, that glycation effect. So when you have just high levels of glucose, they can just bind and damage your body, and they actually cook. And so when I'm doing surgery on a patient and I have to open up their scalp and I look at their skull and I have to open their skull, babies, it's bleach white. It's so bright white because it hasn't been glycated, and it hasn't had that browning, that Maillard reaction. As people get older, it starts to yellow, sort of gets a creamy color, sort of an ivory tone, and then older individuals, especially people that have smoked, drank and things like that, it's actually brown. It's almost like a light brown, and
it's literally cooking.
It's literally cooking. It's literally browning from the inside out, and that permanently damages the tissue. And this is where you get all the downstream effects of other complications of diabetes. So you have multi-organ failure. You get atherosclerosis. You get it's the number one cause of kidney failure. You can damage the vascular supply to your feet, and people have to get amputations, which is a devastating thing to have happen. You go blind, get diabetic retinopathy, Alzheimer's is now being called type 3 diabetes, and so on and so forth. So this is just damaging your body from the inside out. Fructose has 4 or 5 times the glycative effect that glucose has. So fructose is far more harmful from a glycation point of view than glucose is. And it affects your body differently. Your body really tries desperately to keep this out of your body because it is damaging to your body. And so it gets processed and broken down in your liver, which damages your liver. And UCSF biochemistry department with Dr. Robert Lustig showed back in 2009 that fructose gets metabolized and broken down into the same byproducts as alcohol. So you get the acetaldehydes, you get all the harmful byproducts, you get fatty droplets. So you get all this fat accumulation and damage into your liver. So you can actually get fatty liver disease. You can get cirrhosis. It causes peripheral insulin resistance, which is type 2 diabetes, and can contribute to atherosclerosis, Alzheimer's, cancer, etc. At least is strongly associated with those issues. So and this is something that Lustig points out in some of his talks and his books, is that specifically the traditional Japanese diet eliminates fructose, right? And so that's a very low fructose diet. So that could be one beneficial thing. The other thing is just the ultra processed food, the seed oils, these sorts of things. I mean, you do see other populations that may have higher carbohydrates, sort of natural whole food sort of carbohydrates. They don't have all the processed foods. They don't have any of the seed oils, and they typically have a much lower disease burden rate. Now, it's not going to be absent of diseases and things like that, because excessive carbohydrates will still cause these issues. But you look at Okinawa, which is considered a blue zone. When those blue zones have been re-examined, there was a professor at Oxford, I'm blanking on his name at the moment, but he published just in recent years a paper looking at re-examining that data, and he actually found that some of the blue zones ate a lot more meat than they were supposed to have, and B, that it really came down to pension fraud, that people had been lying about their age so that they were older, so that they qualified for pensions earlier, or they had elderly relatives that had already died, but they just didn't tell the government so they could keep collecting a check. And so, you do have populations that have been eating carbohydrates for longer, and they would have more defenses against the harmful effects of carbohydrates and the toxins therein. But that doesn't mean that they're immune to them. Again, Native Americans, indigenous Australians, they get the exact same diseases that European Americans and European descent Australians get, but they get it at a far higher rate. So the diseases are still there. It's just at a higher rate. So when this was something that I learned as a child that sort of influenced my thinking, which was that when eating a Western diet, Native Americans are 4 times as likely to get all these chronic diseases. And so it just sort of struck me that must mean that it's from the diet, because if they don't eat the diet, they don't eat a Western diet, they don't get those diseases, and
And you'd see these diseases manifesting earlier than you would see in Europeans in general, I imagine.
True, and even in European populations, they're manifesting earlier and earlier and earlier as the decades go on. In medicine, you look at different diseases, and this is where typically you have these sort of these peaks at different levels. Okay, this sort of peaks in the 30s or the 40s or the 50s or the 60s, or maybe some more childhood-related illnesses and diseases. Strokes, heart attacks, dementia, these sorts of things typically later on in life. Diabetes, type 2 diabetes, later on in life. Now they're becoming younger and younger and younger and younger and younger. In fact, in the 1990s or before, type 2 diabetes wasn't called type 2 diabetes. It was called adult onset diabetes, because it really only happened in adults. So it's juvenile and adult. And then you had 10-year-olds getting adult onset diabetes, and they got fatty liver disease. And they said, well, hold on a second. Only alcoholics get fatty liver disease. This child's 10. He's never had alcohol in his life, and he's getting adult onset diabetes, but he's a child. How can he do that? And instead of actually examining this for 1 second and thinking, okay, what's changed? What have we done differently? They just said, it's probably already always happening. We just didn't notice it. And it's just this throwaway sort of lazy.
I hear that a lot. I hear that messaging a lot in different terms of different diseases.
Yeah, well, and it's just doesn't fit the facts, because you can say that once, but they say, oh, we just weren't paying attention. Fine, okay, so they changed the name to type 2 diabetes and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, instead of actually thinking, okay, what's affecting this kid's liver in the same way as alcohol? In ducks, it's carbohydrates, force feeding them carbohydrates, and Lustig actually showed in something that actually satisfied the Bradford-Hill criteria for causation, that fructose can actually cause fatty liver disease. And removing fructose, even while still having other carbohydrates, glucose-based carbohydrates, can actually reverse fatty liver disease in children. And that's published data that's out there. So instead of thinking about this, they just renamed it. And you can say that once. You can say, okay, well, we just weren't paying attention. Autism, that's another thing. I'm not here to say what causes autism. I don't know. I think it's multifactorial. I think there are multiple things that go into that. I think that's very evidence-based. But one thing I can say is that the rates of autism have been going up and up significantly. And we said this in the 1990s. Said, well, we're seeing higher rates. Wow, we probably weren't just noticing this. Okay, well, then why did it go up again in the 2000s, and then up again in the 2010s, and now up again in the 2020s? Why is that? If we were paying attention since the 1990s, it should have been flatline if that was actually the case, that these rates have not changed. And then why are these affecting younger and younger and younger people? Why are younger people getting affected with Alzheimer's?
And with the severity of autism that we're seeing with so many children nonverbal, this isn't something that could easily be missed or slip under the radar. In terms of the indigenous and native populations that you were mentioning earlier, what do we know about how long these people were living compared to people in other parts of the world?
Depends on how you slice it. Because the thing is that what most people look at, they look at average life expectancy from birth, and that doesn't tell you anything about how long people live when they die of old age. That's not looking at the mean or the median, sort of adult life expectancy. And even from the 1800s, we say that in America, in Australia, and Europe, people only lived into their 30s. Again, that's average life expectancy from birth. And infant mortality rate was excessively high up until the early 20th century in Western countries. And in native populations, it's still excessively high because infant mortality rate is high for all life on Earth in the wild, because babies are vulnerable and they can be susceptible to environment and predators. And so that's a very dangerous time of life. And so infant mortality rate is very high. And so looking at that average life expectancy from birth, yes, that would be sort of lower than other averages. But when you look at how old people are when they die of old age, and they're not dying of diabetes and cancer and heart disease and strokes, they're just living until they sort of run out of time. And so they can actually live a lot longer. Look at the Inuit. I mean, we don't actually have hard numbers on this. We have their own records. I mean, we know that the Native Americans, by their own records in the 1800s, when they were just living on bison in the Great Plains, they were living to be 110, 120 years old, or sometimes longer. The longest lived Native American was a gentleman named Chief John Smith White Wolf. Now, this is their own records. This is just word of mouth. And so people have said, oh, well, that couldn't have been true, X, Y, and Z. But this gentleman said that he was 137. His family said he was 137. His whole tribe said he was 137, and he died in the 1920s. But he also described in multiple episodes, at multiple periods over decades, his experience fighting in the War of 1812. Now, if you're old enough to remember fighting and you're old enough to fight in the War of 1812 and you die in the 1920s, you're pretty damn old. Whether you're 137 or not, you're pretty old. And so, people can say that he's lying and this, that, and the other, but it's just something that we see repeatedly. We see this again and again and again. And it sounds far-fetched that someone would live that long. But we actually know as geneticists that the human body is designed to live 120 years on average, meaning that if you just stay out of your own way and don't mess up, you should make it to 120 without doing anything special. And yet we're dying in our 70s and 80s and we're calling that good. We're saying, oh, 85, that's a good life. 92, oh, that he did really, really well. They died 40 years early, according to their genetics. So something was harming them. Something was damaging them. Something was pulling them back. And I would argue that it's our current modern environment, and food is a main part of that. And so, I mean, look at the Inuit, high infant mortality rate, but they often don't die traditionally. Didn't die of old age. They didn't just go and get sick and then die. How did they die? They actually had a form of euthanasia, where basically when they outlived their usefulness, when they just couldn't support their family as well as they could in the past, they would actually just go outside and expose themselves and just die from exposure and let the polar bears have them. And that's part of what I'm saying. Everybody ends up back. I forget the exact saying, but it ends up being that basically you get eaten by polar bears. Everybody ends up getting eaten by polar bears. But so one of the things is that they chew on hides. So they'll chew on these hides. They're sort of chewing their leather. You say something, oh, this person can't chew their leather. Someone who's older and is weaker isn't out there hunting and contributing in that way. One thing that they can do is they can sort of chew on these hides that the hunters brought back and sort of cure them and turn them into leathers that they can then use as clothing or blankets.
So they still have good teeth if they're able to do that, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so, but we're not rodents, so we don't regrow our teeth. So they basically chew this until they just wear their teeth out to nubbins. And once they run out, they can't eat, they can't contribute. They say, my time's up. I don't want to be a burden on you. And you're in an ice age, or you're in the North Pole, even outside of an ice age. Those are very harsh environments. You can't be dragging dead weight. And so that was their traditional way of meeting the end of their life. In a modern situation where you don't have to chew your leather and your teeth last don't get worn down, or you don't have those harsh environments, you don't have to make that ultimate sacrifice to save your family, they're going to live much longer than that. So they're not dying in the same ways that we are, and they're living much longer than we would expect. But it gets confused with average life expectancy from birth. But these are statistics that we've never taken statistics like that. There's the old saying: there's three kinds of lies. There's damn lies, and there's statistics. And so this is a very good example of that lie of statistics, because in the 1800s, when they started taking these statistics in America, the American Bureau of Statistics started looking at average life expectancy in 1850, and they sort of every decade they sort of add another comparison. But they didn't just look at average life expectancy from birth. They looked at average life expectancy from birth, from 10, from 20, from 30, from 40, 50, 60, 70, and 80. And so why are you keeping statistics on how long people live if they reach 80 if no one gets past 35? And why is it that in the American Constitution, it's required to be at least 35 to even run for president if everyone dies at 35? That's a pretty dumb age to make the minimum requirement. And of course, that doesn't pass the smell test, because the founding fathers of America died in their 80s and 90s, born in the 1700s, died in their 80s and 90s, unless they were killed by something or someone. And so if you look at those statistics, the American Bureau of Statistics in 1850, the average life expectancy from birth was indeed 38. But the average life expectancy from 10 was 58. So it was just a massive increase right away. And then as you go to 20, 30, 40, it goes up and up and up and up and up. And so you're not dying of childhood illnesses. That's the main one. But then also war and famine and all these sorts of things. It was a tougher time. But as you got to adulthood or middle age, on average, you make it to nearly the same age that you would now in modern times. And so that's the same with these primitive populations. Now, the other thing is, when you look at the fossil record, there's a lot of misinformation there as well, because when you look at a skeleton, medically, you look at this, there are certain things that you can look for to judge the age of a skeleton, or how old that person was when they died. And one has to do with the sutures and the bones fusing. And so there are certain bones that fuse at different times. The last bone to fuse is something called the rhomboid sutures in the back of your head. And that typically fuses at about 35. And so once that's fused and you have a skeleton, all the bones are fused, you can say that person was at least 35. After that, we have no idea. And so that is conflated with everyone died at 35. That's not true. That's completely untrue. That just means that that's the oldest that we can positively say someone was. After that, we have no idea. They could have been 95, they could have been 105, or they could have been 35. It would look exactly the same. Say, oh, well, if it's older, they should have signs of disease, signs of wear, signs of arthritis. No. In fact, before the agricultural revolution, we did not see that. We only saw that after the agricultural revolution. That's when we started seeing degenerative processes like arthritis, like infectious disease, like poor wound healing. And we saw the height of people shrank, the height and health of people shrank, the jaw size shrank, teeth became crooked, crowded, had signs of rotting teeth and cavities, and brain size actually shrank immediately. This does not take hundreds of years, does not take thousands of years. This was within a generation or two. And we saw this in real time with the indigenous Australians and indigenous Americans. We saw this in real time. They shrank significantly, and their brains shrank too, and they became sicker. There's a study called Tallest in the World in 2001. They looked at original source data in the late 1800s for Native Americans in the Great Plains, and they found that they were the tallest human beings alive on Earth. They were several inches taller than European Americans at the time. And the really interesting part about that was this was done in the late 1800s, after the bison were killed. So they'd already shifted their diet to a more Western diet. That was the point of wiping out the bison, was that it would wipe out their food supply. And it did. And so now they had to transition into a more Western diet. And so in that data, it says very clearly that the older adults were far taller. So the fathers and grandfathers were far taller than the young adult males. And that if they'd done this study 100 years earlier, that they would have been far taller, probably, well over 6 feet tall. And so, that we saw in real time. We saw that in the fossil record as well. And so
Essentially,
before,
the introduction of the Western diet to these populations was like biological warfare.
yeah, well, it was. I mean, it really was. We, we, that was part of the warfare in the American Indian Wars, was wiping out the food supply, wiping out the bison, and then it forced them to be beholden to agricultural based crops. And you control the food supply, you control the people. And this is we get into theories on what people are trying to do, but people are trying to control the food supply. They're trying to limit meat. They're trying to stop people from being able to buy meat. They're trying to convince people they shouldn't buy meat. I mean, the Romans did this as well. We all know the saying when the plebeians would get uppity and start to think about revolting, they would pass out bread and make circuses, bread and circuses, bread and circuses, appease the masses. The flip side of that coin,
Bread and what?
bread and circuses. The saying bread and circuses. Yeah, there was an old saying, was that in Rome, basically when people were getting upset with how they were being governed, that they would give out free bread and they would put on circuses and gladiatorial events and things like that to just appease the masses. So this is junk food Netflix in today's terms, right? And the flip side of that coin that they don't tell you about with bread and circuses back in Rome is they also cut off the meat supply to Rome. So you could only get bread. But that's okay because you're getting free bread. And now you're watching these circuses and you're getting distracted by these shiny lights and you're eating this junk food and you just go like, I don't care anymore, And that was something that was done to control large populations in the city when they were looking like they were going to revolt. So the British did this for years. They limited the meat supply to the peasants, to the serfs, to the Irish, to the people in India and elsewhere. That was something that was wasn't fully exclusively, but it was more reserved for the upper classes, for the nobility. The nobility got to eat meat. And if you were caught poaching and eating those animals, you could be executed as a poacher. But it was so important to get that food that people risked their lives to get that meat for their family and things like that. So it's very, very important. So with the Native Americans, you control the food supply, you control that population as well. They wiped out their native food supply. Now they're beholden on other sources of food. Now you've got them. And that was definitely part of that warfare.
That is extremely thought-provoking and a very interesting take on the statistics for longevity, and to consider the human consumption of meat and how it's actually been used, or its deprivation has been used as a form of warfare. In a moment, we'll hear how food can function like a narcotic. But first, here's a look at my earlier talk with Dr. Chaffee on the cancer-fighting potential of the carnivore diet.
You inject glucose into someone, and then you see where that goes, and those cancer cells light up like a Christmas tree. Every time someone with cancer eats carbohydrates, that's what's happening. When they go onto this ketogenic diet approach, actually the tumors are shrinking, and they're improving, they're regaining neurological function. We get fatty liver disease. We don't understand how we get it, but we know how we get that in livestock intentionally. We force feed ducks grains for 2 weeks and they get completely infiltrated livers.
Dr. Chaffee will share how eating carnivore can prevent and even fight cancer. Afterward, find the link to that video at the top of the comments and also in this video's description below. And subscribe for full access to our ever-expanding insight on fine-tuning your health. Just hit the big red button below. Now we cut to the present, and we have such a deliberate design of food to the point that it's become addictive. I mean, how different is food now to a narcotic?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree. And Dr. Lustig argues that, you look at that, well, fructose, we know fructose is essentially a narcotic. It gives a large dopamine response to the addiction centers of your brain, just like cocaine, heroin, and meth. And yes, other things give a dopamine response, but this gives such a level of dopamine that it has an addictive nature, just like cocaine, heroin, and meth. And it has such a strong effect that it can actually kill those areas of the brain because of that large dopamine effect. And so MRI studies have actually shown that people that are addicted to sugar or people that are addicted to meth, the same areas of their brain have died off. You give a normal person an amphetamine like Vyvanse or some sort of Adderall or whatever, those areas of the brain will just light up like a Christmas tree. You give that same dose to a meth addict, barely twinkles. There's not much left. You give that same dose to a sugar addict who's metabolically sick, same barely twinkle as the meth addict. So this is a drug. This is a narcotic. We're in the midst of the modern opium trade. No one realizes how harmful this stuff is, and people are building empires based upon it. They make trillions of dollars a year on sugar and the consumption of sugar, and then many more trillions of dollars a year treating the ill effects of that sugar consumption as well. So this is major issue. And Lustig actually showed. I've argued a long time that sugar, fructose, should be a controlled substance and should at least be age restricted in kids, because it's so detrimental to the developing brain. And Lustig actually talked about that as well, that the legal criteria for age restricting something and legally controlling a substance, that fructose meets all of those criteria for that. So I hope that we get there one day, that we recognize these things as harmful addictive substances that need to be eliminated or at least age restricted. Sort of weird to think about like a donut being 18 and older, but seriously, it's that bad.
Truly, and I think there really is a mass awakening that needs to take place if people are really going to be able to preserve their health. Hopefully, through conversations like these, we can nudge things in that direction. Thank you very much, Anthony. It's been great to speak to you. I look forward to doing it again soon.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Certainly, there is compelling evidence throughout history of people and groups living even longer than most people live today. The case of Chief John Smith possibly living to 137 is a notable example. Taking this into consideration, and also the genetic evidence that we have the potential to live well beyond 100 years, the burning question is, why aren't we commonly living that long? Well, given the rise of type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, and cancers linked to obesity, the modern diet is a likely culprit in the limitation of the human lifespan, with ultra-processed food being the leading suspect. Up next, also with Dr. Chaffee, learn how the carnivore diet could be a potent defense against cancer. But first, is New York really as dangerous as movies and TV shows would have us believe? Ray Byrne, our special reporter from Australian HQ, hits the streets to find out.
New York, the big bad apple. Home of the Ninja Turtles, Detective Sipowicz, and Professor X. Even so, crime persists. 339 complaints of major crime every day. At least, that's what the figures say. I hit the streets to see if the data matches the reality. Are you recording me because you're concerned that I'm a safety danger?
Evidence.
Talk about merch falling off the back of a truck. This loot sure looks like it does. I got tons of this stuff, and it's all broken. What idiot am I going to be able to unload this on? Huh?
Is New York still a hotbed of criminal activity and mafia organizations?
What is this, an investigation?
This is a special investigation. I'm Ray Byrne, correspondent, Australian HQ. Is organized crime still rife in Lower Manhattan? Sorry, can I get your name first so we can have it appear on screen?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
The name's Julius MacArthur. You got that? Okay. The real problem, it's not organized crime. Listen, the cops and the feds, they'll tell you that because they're always looking for their next hot clickbait photo op. No, the real danger is slipping and tripping and falling from cracks in the pavement. I mean, they're everywhere. Look at this sidewalk. It's a disaster zone. Listen, if the fall doesn't kill you, the lawsuits will. You're lucky you got insurance, right?
Mum just said I should make sure I bring thermal innerwear in case it gets cold while I'm here.
What? I can't believe it. You're not covered? Well, actually, your mother does get extra credit for reminding you of certain kinds of coverage. But I have to tell you, it's good luck that you bumped into me today because I am a licensed insurance broker.
I try to get travel insurance in Australia, but because I'm allergic to animal hair and commercial hygiene products, they wouldn't give me a policy.
That's discrimination.
Yeah. I'm also allergic to shellfish, and I'm hypersensitive to ultraviolet light.
That's okay. Listen, I'm going to head out to the office and I'll roll out the policy. You know, and I'll be back in 20 minutes. I just need a $250 deposit.
Deposit?
Yeah. So I could lock in the premium before the office closes.
I've only got three $100 notes.
I'll break it and make change and bring it back to you. How about two 10s and a 20? You don't trust me?
No, I didn't say that.
Listen, I tell you what I'm going to do. And I can't believe I'm doing this. I'm going to give you my grandfather's watch from the war. Huh? I'm going to let you hold it until I get back with your insurance policy.
It says it's 7 o'clock.
Yeah, but yeah, that's why you have to wind it.
It's a digital watch.
The first digital watches you had to wind. You could check that later. You know, so I'm going to head over to the office and I'll be back in 30 minutes, all right?
Clearly, Julius had lost track of time without his grandfather's watch. Even so, I was confident he'd eventually track me down to get it back. Now it's time to move on, confident that I am insured against any and all accidental injuries. What adventures await Ray when he hits Chinatown? Watch Uproot Fear, a Vital Signs video on controlling anxiety through visualization. Watch to the end. And you can find the link to Cancer Antidote with Dr. Chaffee in the top comment and the description below. It's been great to be with you. I'm Brendon Fallon, and this is Vital Signs.